Hello there, my friends, and welcome. It is I, the Grimdark narrator, and this is officially my first lore content video for the channel. It's not the first video on the channel, but then again, the previous channel updates weren't exactly, lore content. And after a fashion, neither is this one. This is gonna be my attempt at making some brand new content for this channel. For those that are still wondering, no, I haven't recovered my old channel yet, and truth be told, I don't know if I ever will. But I don't want to get into that depressing topic today, so let us move on to something more positive. For a while now, I wanted to give a shot to making some videos which are reviews/discussions on various Warhammer novels. Given that I read some 250 of them, give or take, not to brag or anything, combined of course from both Fantasy and 40k over the last 15 years or so. That said, I think I am in a good position, because of that, to offer some opinions and reviews on these things, for those who might be wondering what books are and aren't worth reading. This is gonna be me mostly talking freely about the topic and the books, although I will strive to have some kind of structure to these videos when I make more. Also, for those who actually haven't read this particular book or series that we're gonna be talking about today, there are gonna be some light spoilers. I'm not gonna be detailing the plot from A to B, but I will be making some references. And since Warhammer Fantasy has been a main focus of the whole channel from the very beginning, I thought, why not start with arguably the most famous Warhammer Fantasy book series of all? And that is Gotrek and Felix. This is not only one of my favorite book series, across all fantasy actually, not just Warhammer, but I do think it's also the longest book series in Warhammer Fantasy overall. A book series that spans, I think, 16 volumes or 15, if you count the unnumbered spin-off-esque volumes and the short story anthologies. Next, let's say a few words about Gotrek and Felix as a series and in general, before we go into more details on the stories of the first volume. I think this might be also helpful for those viewers, or listeners rather, who don't actually know what all this is about. Gotrek and Felix is a series predominantly focused on the characters in the title. Gotrek and Felix, who would have guessed? Gotrek is a dwarf belonging to a group called the Slayer cult. And these guys are basically suicidal dwarf warriors who want to find the biggest, meanest and strongest enemy possible and get themselves killed while fighting it, and ideally killing that enemy as well. Of course, their patron god, Grimnir, doesn't want them to just sit around and wait to get killed. They always have to fight anything they fight to the very best of their ability. They can't slack around. The quote-unquote problem is that Gotrek is such a great fighter that he always manages to kill or defeat whatever he and Felix are fighting. And the gimmick of the series is literally in the title of each book, as that's usually the end boss, so to speak, of whatever adventure they're on. Of course, some of the book titles are a bit more vague, so you can't know what they're gonna end up fighting, but for the most part, you can tell from the title. Felix, on the other hand, is a human poet who almost unwittingly gets roped into recording Gotrek's journey and being commissioned, basically, by Gotrek to write an epic poem about his upcoming death. Thing is, this death just keeps failing to materialize, to Gotrek's perpetual frustration, as this dwarf is pretty much a killing machine that defeats anything and everything that gets in his way. And Felix in all this is usually the voice of reason, as the stories are at least partially told from his perspective. And that's pretty much it for a very brief summary of this. It's just these two going around fighting monsters and uncovering plots and schemes and having adventure and searching for treasure and meeting all kinds of over-the-top characters, some of which are recurring, like Max or Ulrika or Snorri or Malachi and others. Now, concerning Trollslayer, it is obviously the first volume in the Gotrek and Felix saga, first published all the way back in 1999. Although I have read some comments saying that some of these stories, if not all these stories, did pop up even earlier as standalone entries or published in other volumes or collections. And speaking of stories, plural, it is definitely worth mentioning, in my opinion, how this volume is quite different from the rest of the saga. And I'm not just talking about the saga changing authors multiple times. Trollslayer is not, in fact, a full novel with a beginning and end. It's actually a collection of short stories, 7 of them in total, and we're gonna be saying a few words about each of them in a few minutes. Though thankfully these stories do maintain a level of continuity regardless. So while you can read pretty much each one as a standalone experience, there is progression to the adventure regardless. Now, before we say a few words about the particular stories in this volume, I think we should definitely give some praise to author William King, who obviously wrote other things outside of Gotrek and Felix or Warhammer Fantasy. But among the older fans, I'd say that there's a consensus he's the best Gotrek and Felix author. Not to dismiss, the works of Nathan Long later, or David Geimer even later than that, but King is definitely the one who set the tone of the saga. He imbues old-fashioned sword and sorcery, which actually shouldn't be out of place in something like Conan the Barbarian even, to be honest. In fact, now that I think about it, Gotrek Gunnison would definitely not be out of place in a Conan story. He is definitely over the top and serious enough, but I digress. Even though there is definitely a lot of humor in this volume, it never descends into, a full-blown parody. Except maybe that one story where Gotrek has amnesia, but we're gonna get to that. My point being with all of this is that King definitely formed the blueprint for the entire saga. There's pretty much a bit of everything. There's action, there's adventure, there's even romance, and of course there's a lot of humor. But these are blended in a way that, at least in my opinion, does make the books very difficult to put down once you get into them. And there's the added advantage, or maybe disadvantage if you really love them, that they are fairly short. Of course, they're a lot simpler in plotting than something like A Song of Ice and Fire, which has like 85 million characters, but that also means you can pick this one up and get absorbed right away in the adventures of this eponymous duo. There's also many people who say that the series went downhill after William King left, or passed the torch, so to speak. But we're definitely gonna talk more about that when we reach Giant Slayer and respectively Orc Slayer. One way or another, thank you, William King. Moving on, let's take a look at the actual stories from Trollslayer, of which, as I said earlier, there are 7. They are Geheimnisnacht, Wolf Riders, The Dark Beneath the World, The Mark of Slanesh, Blood and Darkness, The Mutant Master, and Ulric's Children. I didn't mention this before, but this quote-unquote short story format is actually gonna continue in the second volume too, Skaven Slayer, before switching on to the regular full novel format with the third volume, that is Demon Slayer. And before we get into saying a few words about each one, like I said at the start, I don't want these reviews and discussions to be entirely spoiler-tastic, but I am gonna be summarizing what happens to a short degree. I will do my best not to get into specifics or any twists, because I don't want to ruin the experience for people who haven't read them. So, story number 1 is Geheimnisnacht, or as it's also known in the Warhammer world, the Night of Secrets. This one might actually be the very first story featuring Gotrek and Felix ever written, really. We are introduced to our famous duo as they arrive at an inn during an infamous day called Geheimnisnacht. This is, in a way, the Halloween of the Warhammer Old World. Except, with real monsters. It's also one of the shorter stories from the volume, so there's not much to say about it, except that they do fight some chaos cultists. And it is right from the get-go that we kinda learn that this series doesn't take itself that seriously, or at least not at this early stage, since there's actually a great deal of humor in it already. The second story is Wolf Riders, and while the plot of this one isn't hugely relevant to the wider saga, there is one element from it that actually is. And that's a girl named Kirsten, whom Felix meets for the first time here. I'm saying it's important because this girl is basically Felix's first love, and she will get mentioned quite a lot of times in the future and upcoming books, whenever Felix has a new quote-unquote girlfriend. It's a story I actually enjoyed a bit more than Geheimnisnacht, because it's partially a story of survival. The heroes join a caravan of merchants, I think it was, and then they have to defend a fort against a warband of goblin wolf riders. So in a way it has a bit of an Alamo vibe. The third story is The Dark Beneath the World, and I think this is the longest one in the volume, although I didn't look at the page count. It is also during this one that we see the endgame boss fight, which you learn from the title of the volume. And this particular end boss fight is a troll. But it's not just any average troll, and I'm not gonna spoil it more than that. This story is also important because we learn how Felix obtains a magical sword that he will be using throughout the rest of the entire saga. And there's actually gonna be some future plot points too involving this sword in future books. But I'm not gonna spoil them now. Lastly, this is a story about an expedition going beneath the mountains to a lost dwarf hold. So if you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, and the part where they go to Moria, this might be right up your alley. The fourth story is The Mark of Slanesh, and without a doubt I think this is one of the funniest of the entire volume, if not the funniest. Basically, while fighting some chaos cultists, again, Gotrek gets hit in the head with a rock and forgets who he is. So for the rest of the story, Felix has to do some fetch quests, basically, for a rather dubious doctor who is actually trying to get Gotrek's memories back. But as an amnesiac, Gotrek is kinda helpless and useless for the one time in his life. So Felix has to both take care of him and win the day and get his memories back. The fifth story is Blood and Darkness. This one is titled a bit generically, and I'd say it's one of the more serious stories from the volume. Not to spoil anything, but it does feature another character that will become important a few volumes from now. In this one, Gotrek and Felix have to fight a warband of beastmen and a rather unusual chaos champion, and I'm not gonna say more than that. The sixth story is called The Mutant Master. This is one where basically the duo gets to fight a crazy sorcerer and mad scientist in a Frankenstein's castle type of environment, complete with mutants and all the creations and experiments of that sorcerer. It's a pretty straightforward story and very Frankenstein-esque in vibe. The final story is Ulrich's Children, and I'd say this one might be the one that leans into horror the most from this volume. It also features some werewolf action, but with a bit of a twist. It's also probably the story that's the darkest in retrospective and theme, and I'd also say that it reinforces the theme that despite the humor in the series, the Warhammer Fantasy and the old world is a very dangerous place and unforgiving and cruel. And these are all the stories from Trollslayer, Volume 1 from the saga. Despite the fact that the title's boss creature is from The Dark Beneath the World, I think there's at least a couple of stories here that are a bit more interesting or original. Not that that story is bad. None of these are bad in my opinion, or boring. But of course, at the end of the day, these things are always subjective. Personally, my favorites from this volume are Wolf Riders and maybe The Mutant Master, because that one made me laugh a lot. Next, as we're getting close to the end of the video, I'd also like to cover an aspect which most definitely will be brought up by anyone watching this as a review. And that is the scoring aspect for these books that we're talking about. Now, I'm not gonna be scoring this particular book today, because this video is also kind of a prototype to see what people think about this and how I can improve it or change it. However, I am gonna say that this book is definitely worth reading. It does provide an attention-worthy set of adventures that are pretty much short and sweet, and that not only introduce the reader to the lengthy Gotrek and Felix saga overall, but also to the Warhammer Fantasy universe in general. I'm actually happy to say that Trollslayer was one of the very first Warhammer novels I ever read, and at the time I absolutely adored it. In fact, I then did my best to find and read everything else in the series, and at the time, I think Trollslayer was the latest one, so I had to wait afterwards quite a lot. And if you're a fan of the series, you know that after Zombie Slayer, it took forever for the story to continue, at least the main story. We also had a couple of volumes that were basically spin-offs, like The Serpent Queen and Road of Skulls, which happened a lot earlier than that, but anyway. And even when the story did continue, it became kinda depressing. But of course, that's a different story for a different video, especially if I'm gonna cover each of these volumes separately. Now that is something I would like to do, although those videos are likely to be shorter than this one, but it remains to be seen. Also, if you'd like to see more content in this vein, check out my Patreon page. Or if you'd like to see the old lore videos from the old channel, check out my Rumble page. We are actually past 500 lore videos there, re-uploaded. And the links for both are in the video description, as always, so please check them out if you want to support me. Next, before I say goodbye for today, I would very much appreciate it if you folks could let me know what you think about this possible series. I do welcome any and all impressions as long they're civil, and any suggestions or advice or any other thought of yours. I am open to reviewing pretty much any Warhammer book, provided I read it, obviously. But both in the case of Fantasy and 40k, there is, like I said, more than 200 titles that I can talk about with some knowledge and safely. And do feel free to tell me what you'd like to see in such a series. Is it more discussion about the plot? More spoilers? Less spoilers? The themes? The technical aspects? I'm open to any idea. I'm not gonna be able to do these with anything approaching the frequency I did for the old channel, but I would try maybe once or twice a week. Of course, it depends upon the reception of this video as well. If this gets like 50 views, well, you can draw your own conclusion. Also, you can tell me if you'd like to see me in the video, as in, webcam me, like in a corner or something. I didn't record myself for this episode, but if enough people want it, I could do it in the future. And that's pretty much it for today. Thanks a lot for watching, and I wish you all a safe and healthy day. Sigmar's blessings be upon you.